Earth is a wonderful but delicate place. A perfect balance of events occurred for this planet to support life. But what if Earth spun sideways instead? Or what would happen if all the ice melted overnight? We explore what would happen to Earth in these extreme scenarios. This is What If.
Early in the history of our solar system, something mysteriously knocked Earth slightly off its axis. So today, we tilt at 23.5 degrees. But what would happen if we tilted even more? What if Earth spun sideways on its axis? Well, it wouldn't take long before utter chaos ensued. One of the most important consequences of Earth's axial tilt is the seasons. Seasons happen because the tilt points different parts of the planet toward the sun at different times of the year. But the tilt also means that different parts of the globe receive different amounts of sunlight during each season. And that's where a more extreme tilt starts to cause problems. Right now, during the summer in the northern hemisphere, places far north, like Utqiagvik, Alaska, receive 24 hours of sunlight for 82 days straight. Because Earth is tilted far enough on its axis that as the planet rotates, Utqiagvik never leaves direct sunlight. On the other hand, the contiguous US receives a max of 17 hours a day, because after that, it rotates out of daytime sunlight and into night. But if we tilted Earth's axis even more, to 90 degrees, the US would get sunlight 24/7, around the clock, for months on end. And it's not just the US. The entire northern hemisphere would be like this. At first, animals would take advantage of the extra light to find and eat more food. Just like Alaskan birds, which feed their chicks extra nutrition in the summer, resulting in faster growing babies than their southern counterparts. And plant growth would explode, since they get their energy directly from sunlight. Farms in northern Alaska, for example, grow cabbages the size of Rottweilers in the summer. But while animals and plants would thrive, humans wouldn't. We evolved to be active during the day and sleep at night. But if we were exposed to unending sunlight, our brains would stop producing the hormone melatonin, which we need to sleep at night. And that could lead to sleep deprivation, depression, and ultimately, a more severe, chronic version of these symptoms called seasonal affective disorder, which already affects 9% of Alaskans, compared to just 6% of the entire United States. But that's less of a worry than the floods. Temperatures at the North Pole would more than double to 38 degrees Celsius from 15.5 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than temperatures at the equator today. As a result, Greenland's ice cap would melt, causing sea levels to rise by 7 meters and flood nearly every coastal city on Earth. Say goodbye to New York, Copenhagen, and Tokyo. To make matters worse, the warmer seas would trigger stronger and more frequent hurricanes, which form when seawater evaporates at the surface. And the weather wouldn't get better when winter comes 6 months later. Out of reach of the sun's direct beams for months at a time, the hemisphere would get colder than any winter on record. Swirls of frigid air, called a polar vortex, which are normally dissipated by warm air in the tropics, could travel all the way down to the equator. Imagine blizzards in Florida, Brazil, Kenya, and all those thriving plants. They'd die from a lack of sunlight. Agriculture would collapse as ecosystems crumble and mass extinctions pile up. And there would be even more floods, because meanwhile, the southern hemisphere is getting toasty, and the South Pole is home to 90% of the world's ice. The constant sunlight would raise its temperature to 38 degrees Celsius from negative 28 degrees Celsius. Melting the ice and raising sea levels by a whopping 61 meters. That's almost as tall as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Greenland's flood would look like a puddle in comparison. So all in all, while a few extra hours in the summer sun would be nice, let's leave the extra seasons to Alaska and be glad the Earth is tilted exactly as it is. Humans might have built civilizations, but insects own the world. After all, over half of all known species are insects. So if they all suddenly vanished, you'd notice. No more summers of singing cicadas and flickering fireflies. No bees to pollinate apple, cherry, peach, or almond trees. No one to make honey. A world without insects means a world with empty grocery store shelves. But that would be just the beginning of our problems. Now, it's impossible to say exactly what would go down, but here's a worst-case scenario of what could happen if all the insects disappeared. There are a few insects most people would be happy to see vanish, like mosquitoes. They kill hundreds of thousands of people every year by transmitting malaria, West Nile virus, and other diseases. But if they disappear tomorrow, we might actually miss them. There are over 3,000 species of mosquitoes on Earth, all of which are food to birds, bats, frogs, and other animals. No more mosquitoes means these creatures and the animals that eat them could go hungry. The same goes for the dreaded cockroach, a protein-packed meal for birds, rodents, and even humans in some parts of the world. If we lost all 4,400 species of roach, entire ecosystems would struggle to survive. Believe it or not, we'd have even worse troubles ahead, since we'd face a serious poop problem without one of the world's greatest recyclers, the dung beetle. You see, history has taught us exactly what happens when these critters can't do their job. Back in 1788, the British introduced cattle to Australia, and these cows pooped a lot. Each one poops enough to fill 5 tennis courts every year. But while the dung beetles back in Britain would eat and break down cow poo, the native Australian beetles wouldn't touch the stuff because they evolved to munch only on dry, fibrous marsupial dung. So the cow poop piled up. By 1960, the cattle had carpeted 500,000 acres of pasture in dung. That's enough to cover over half of Rhode Island. And while a little bit of poop is great for fertilizer, this ocean of dung would flood plants with nitrogen, making it impossible for anything to grow. So imagine if all 8,000 species of dung beetle, plus other dew-dining insects like flies, vanished worldwide. The land would be knee-deep in, farmland, forest, and desert would all collapse. And floating throughout would be loads of corpses. You see, most animals won't eat dead bodies. That's where flesh-eating beetles, aka dermestids, and other corpse-munching insects come in. Over 500 species of these grisly undertakers live worldwide, devouring dead flesh until nothing but bone remains. Without them, there would be fewer custodians around to clean up the mess. Sure, there would still be hungry vultures and bacteria around to help, but it wouldn't be enough. So that's where we could end up in an insectless world, starving to death while drowning in a sea of poop and corpses. 43% of Americans say they're too tired to function. So odds are, you're pretty exhausted. Some mornings, you might even fantasize about staying in bed forever. Hey, look, your wish came true. You got food, a bedpan, and an endless stream of podcasts to binge. Everything you need to never move again. But it won't be long until you realize that you've made a terrible mistake. People spend lazy Sundays or sick days in bed all the time and are no worse for wear. But if you don't start moving again after about 24 hours, one of the first things to change is your lungs. Gravity isn't pulling them down into their normal position anymore, so the lower part of your lungs will crumple up. You probably won't feel any different, but watch out, because it's harder for mucus to pass through those collapsed passages, so it can get trapped, which can infect your lungs and ultimately lead to pneumonia. That's why doctors tell people on bed rest to sit up and cough from time to time. But you're way too engrossed in those podcasts to remember to cough. Within a week, your problems only get worse. You see, normally your muscles and bones help support your weight under gravity. But now that you're lying down, they're out of a job. And as the saying goes, if you don't use them, you lose them. For every week in bed, you lose about 1% of your bone density, making your bones more brittle and easy to fracture. That's why astronauts, who often go for months without gravity, exercise for at least 2 hours a day and load up on calcium. In that same week, you also lose 1% of your muscle mass, particularly in your thighs, butt, and shoulders, which you're no longer using. Now, normally, those muscles would suck sugar from your blood for energy to function. But after just 10 days of bed rest, this process slows down. The result? All of that unused sugar can build up in your bloodstream and lead to type 2 diabetes. By week 2, you can start developing nasty ulcers called bed sores. These form when the bony parts of your body, like your hips, tailbone, and ankles, press against the same spot for too long. The constant pressure blocks blood flow, killing your skin cells. And if you're not careful, they can even rip through layers of skin and tissue and expose your bones and muscles. Which sounds like the opposite of relaxing. Meanwhile, those muscles are wasting away faster than ever. After just 2 weeks, you've lost a whopping 10% of your muscle mass. And that causes a new problem, because the less muscle you have, the less oxygen, and therefore blood flow, they need. So, after a month in bed, your heart pumps 30% less blood per beat. And with less oxygen circulating through your body, you feel more tired, even though you've been resting for a solid month. And if you don't get up soon, well, you're going to have a hard time ever getting up again. Because 6 months, maybe a year in, most of your muscles have wasted away. Your bones are too weak and fragile to bear your weight, and your heart isn't strong enough to do much work anytime soon. Meanwhile, your brain isn't a happy camper either. After all, you've been stuck in the same room for months, staring at the same walls, the same spot on the ceiling, having the same experiences day after day. Not great for mental health, to say the least. A study of pregnant women found that bed rest increased their risk of anxiety and depression, and some women reported feeling isolated, out of control, and imprisoned. So no, a year of uninterrupted bed rest is not the relaxing paradise we'd all dream it'd be. And this is exactly why doctors try to get their patients up and walking as quickly as possible. In the meantime, medical staff turn people every 2 hours to keep bed sores at bay and encourage them to do exercises in bed to get their heart and muscles working. So just keep in mind, there's nothing wrong with a lazy Sunday morning, as long as you're up and moving before Monday strikes. 99% of all freshwater ice on Earth is sitting on top of Greenland and Antarctica. And each year, a little more of it melts into the ocean. Normally, it would take hundreds to thousands of years for it all to melt away. But what if something happened that caused a massive global melt overnight? As we slept, sea levels would rise by a whopping 66 meters. Coastal cities like New York, Shanghai, and London would drown in the apocalyptic mass flood, forcing up to 40% of the world's population out of their homes. While all this chaos ensues above ground, something equally sinister is happening below. All that rising salt water will infiltrate groundwater reserves farther inland, forcing its way into nearby freshwater aquifers. You know, the ones that supply our drinking water, irrigation systems, and power plant cooling systems. All those aquifers would be destroyed. Not good. On top of that, the ice on Greenland and Antarctica is made of fresh water. So when it melts, that's about 69% of the world's freshwater supply that's going straight into the oceans. This will wreak havoc on our ocean currents and weather patterns. Take the Gulf Stream, for example. It's a strong ocean current that brings warm air to northern Europe and relies on dense salty water from the Arctic in order to function. But a flood of fresh water would dilute the current and could weaken or even stop it altogether. Without that warm air, temperatures in northern Europe would plummet, and that could spawn a mini ice age, according to some experts. That's not even the worst of it. Take a look at what will happen when that last 1% of freshwater ice that's not part of Greenland or Antarctica thaws. Some of that 1% is sitting in glaciers farther inland. The Himalayan glaciers specifically pose one of the largest threats because of what's trapped inside. Toxic chemicals like dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, or DDT. Scientists discovered that glaciers like this can store these chemicals for decades. But as they thaw, those glaciers release the chemicals into rivers, lakes, and groundwater reserves, poisoning each one as they go. The rest of that 1% is hanging out underground, mostly in the Arctic tundra, as something called permafrost. Permafrost is organic matter that's been frozen in the ground for 2+ years. Now, one of the most immediate problems with thawing permafrost would be mercury poisoning. That's right, there are an estimated 15 million gallons of mercury stored up in the Arctic permafrost. That's almost equal to the amount of mercury everywhere else on Earth. On top of that, the organic matter in permafrost is a tasty meal for microorganisms. After they digest it all, they fart out two of the most potent greenhouse gases out there: carbon dioxide and methane. Scientists estimate this could double the current levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and potentially cause global temperatures to rise by 3.5 degrees Celsius compared to today. That might not sound like much, but say goodbye to that mini European ice age, and even rivers and lakes around the world. They'd evaporate from the higher temperatures and cause mass droughts and desert-like climates. And all that extra water vapor in the atmosphere would fuel more frequent and stronger storms, floods, and hurricanes. So, all of that newly established coastline on the eastern US would be one of the last places you'd want to live. Instead, there would be mass migrations to Canada, Alaska, the Arctic, and even what's left of the Antarctic. And you're right, this is probably never going to happen. After all, there's enough ice right now to cover the entire continent of North America in a sheet a mile thick. So the next time you hear about record-breaking heat or ultra-powerful hurricanes, at least you know that it could be worse. But scientists estimate that if we don't take action and global temperatures increase by just 1 degree Celsius, the effects of climate change we already see today will be irreversible. So yes, it could be worse, and it will be if we're not careful. Earth zooms around the sun at 110,000 kilometers per hour. But what if it just stopped? Well, for one thing, you'd have only a month to live. First off, if Earth stopped short, you'd actually die immediately, because you'd fly off the planet and hurtle into space, just like you lurch forward in a car when a driver slams on the brakes. But if Earth slows down more gradually, you'd instead suffer a slower, but still horrific death. That's because the planet is about to get very, very hot. You see, the sun's tremendous gravity pulls the Earth right toward it. Meanwhile, the planet is trying to whiz away in this direction. This tug of war keeps us in orbit. But if the Earth slows down and stops, the sun wins and yanks us toward our doom. In fact, a model from the University of Colorado shows us how long that terrible trip would take. Just 2 months. In the first week, you wouldn't notice much of a change. The average global temperature would climb less than 1 degree Celsius and hover around 16 degrees for another week. But the closer we get, the stronger the sun's pull and the faster we go. This causes the temperature to rise exponentially. By day 21, global temperatures will have jumped to 35 degrees. That's hotter than an average day in the Sahara. And with desert heat comes desert droughts, sparking wildfires and killing crops. UV radiation from the sun is so strong, we'd get severe sunburn after just 15 minutes outdoors. At this point, our bodies also will have hit the upper limit of their heat tolerance. Any hotter, and heat stroke can set in, leading to exhaustion, delirium, or even a coma. And guess what? It gets hotter. By day 35, global temperatures will reach 48 degrees. That's as hot as an average summer day in Death Valley, one of the hottest places on Earth. Most mammals, birds, and insects die as the proteins that make up their cells start to cook. Yes, even roaches can't withstand this apocalypse. If we want to live, we need some indoor air conditioning, stat. Except, the amount of energy you need to run millions of AC units at once would wipe out power grids around the world. So, with no way to keep cool, humanity dies. By day 41, the Earth has passed by Venus. We're now the second planet from the sun, and temperatures have climbed to 66 degrees. But believe it or not, some creatures still cling to life, like Thermus aquaticus, a bacteria that lives in Yellowstone's hot geysers. But less than a week later, temperatures are hot enough to boil water and kill even that bacteria. By day 54, temperatures surpass 160 degrees, and the last remnant of life on Earth flickers out. Soon after, the barren planet crosses Mercury's orbit. For its last week of existence, Earth is the first planet from the sun. Until day 65, the final day. By now, the sun's extreme gravity stretches the planet into an oval shape, and magma begins to leak through the crust. At about noon, Earth tears apart, bleeding liquid rock as temperatures hit 3,800 degrees. Our planet is no more. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia, killing an estimated 92,000 people. It was the biggest eruption in recorded history. And yet, Tambora was about 1/7 the size of the smallest supervolcano. There are about a dozen of these monsters worldwide, and the last one went off 26,500 years ago in New Zealand, blanketing most of its island in a layer of thick ash. Now, it's extremely unlikely that one of these supervolcanoes would go off anytime soon, let alone multiple eruptions at once. But for curiosity's sake, what would happen if all the world's supervolcanoes erupted at once? If every supervolcano went off, you'd have a hard time finding a safe place to flee to, because almost every continent is home to at least one supervolcano. For example, there's Yellowstone in the US, Ngorongoro in Tanzania, and Toba in Indonesia. So basically, no matter where you are, you're out of luck. But at least you'll have a warning, because weeks or months beforehand, the ground will tremble with earthquakes. Then, when E-Day arrives, the earth-shattering sound would be a dead giveaway that something wasn't right. When Krakatoa, which wasn't even close to the size of a supervolcano, erupted in 1883, it released a roar so loud the sound traveled nearly 4,800 kilometers across the Indian Ocean, shattering windows and deafening people in its path. And since even the smallest super eruption would dwarf Krakatoa's eruption, there is really no telling how much damage this would cause, but it would be epically catastrophic. And let's say you were lucky enough to survive this first wave of destruction. After that, it would be time to find a fallout shelter, because these super eruptions spew billions of tons of ash, volcanic glass, and rock thousands of meters into the air. Not something you want to inhale, or be in the path of, since this cloud of ash doesn't just travel up, it also expands out, crashing across the landscape at jet fighter speeds. It would collapse buildings, contaminate water supplies, and bring down any power grids in its path. And the fallout would extend for hundreds of kilometers. So any cities nearby a supervolcano are immediately toast, as are any planes that attempt to fly people away from the danger. And keep in mind that ash travels. When Toba erupted 74,000 years ago, winds blew ash all the way to India. So if all the supervolcanoes go off at once, volcanic debris would spread across the globe. When the eruption ends, the disaster will have only just started. Because for the next 6 months, much of that supervolcanic ash would linger in the stratosphere and block sunlight, causing global temperatures to plunge by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. That's close to the difference between summer in Rio versus Anchorage, Alaska. In fact, just little Mount Tambora's eruption alone set off the year without a summer, where frosts and blizzards plagued much of the northern hemisphere. So multiply that by the 12 or so supervolcanoes all spewing thick black dust, and you've got a worldwide volcanic winter for the next few years. Tropical forests, which can't handle cold weather, would wither and die, bringing down the millions of animal species that live there. And it's about to get even bleaker. You know that saying, out of the frying pan and into the fire? Well, in addition to ash, those volcanoes also belch toxic gases like sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. And after a few years, just after the winter finally ends, those gases would start to fall from the sky as acid rain. When the Laki volcano erupted in 1783 in Iceland, it rained down so much sulfuric acid that it devastated farmland and wiped out half of all livestock. The next year, a full quarter of Iceland's population died in the resulting famine. So imagine that, but everywhere. And since Laki wasn't even a supervolcano, we're looking at acid rain for the next decade. Say goodbye to civilization, because it probably can't survive a decade-long global famine. Now, there are a few places on Earth that, while still suffering from cold and acid rain and famine, would at least be free from the actual explosions themselves. Like volcanic islands such as the Galapagos or even Hawaii, which ironically is famous for its volcanoes. But the thing is, these volcanoes slowly release flows of lava rather than violently exploding. So, you could at least enjoy a nice view as civilization implodes. Every Christmas Eve, certain traditions say that Santa has just one night to deliver presents to millions of children around the globe. Now, this might seem unreasonable from a scientific perspective, but we wondered, exactly how unreasonable is it? Overall, it's difficult to determine how many people around the world celebrate a Santa-centric Christmas on December 25th. But if we consider certain religious and cultural traditions, we get a rough estimate of about 600 million people. Now, let's say each household has, on average, 2.5 kids. So Santa only needs to visit 240 million homes. Even better? He has more time to get the job done than you might think. Legend has it that he drops by when the kids are asleep. So that gives him 8 hours, right? Well, hold up. We mustn't forget about time zones. There are 24 broad time zones worldwide, each 1 hour apart. So factor in the different Christmas Eve start times across the planet, and Kringle's got a luxurious 31 hours to make his deliveries. Unfortunately, this is where his luck runs out, because just to reach every house, he'll have to fly 1,200 times faster than the world's fastest jet fighter. That's a lot to ask of 9 reindeer, which can only gallop up to 80 kilometers per hour on average. Way too slow. But to be fair, that's the best they can do on the ground. Since we don't know exactly how fast a reindeer can fly, let's assume they can manage those incredible speeds. Even then, the load they have to lug is much too heavy for them. If every kid receives a single mid-sized Lego set, the bag alone would weigh a whopping 600,000 tons, or about 20 Statue of Liberties. Meanwhile, the average reindeer can pull up to twice their weight, or about 225 kilograms. So those deer aren't going anywhere. And even if they could, well, it wouldn't be pretty. For starters, the team would create a massive sonic boom as they hurtle through the air at 3,000 times faster than the speed of sound, deafening any bystanders on the ground below. Merry Christmas, folks! But it gets worse. Once Rudolph and co. take off, they'd vaporize before they reached their first house. Just like how a rocket heats up when it re-enters the atmosphere at tremendous speeds, the reindeer would heat to blistering temperatures that would turn them into venison jerky. And Santa wouldn't fare much better, because he's sitting on what amounts to the worst roller coaster ride on Earth. When a typical coaster accelerates, you get pushed back against your seat. But in Santa's case, to accelerate to those extreme speeds makes for a much stronger push. A force tens of thousands of times stronger than gravity would pin him to the sleigh, smashing his bones and internal organs to jelly. But it's not all doom and gloom. Let's assume Santa and friends miraculously survive this ordeal. He slips his conveniently boneless body through chimney after chimney, drops off the gifts, and now gets to munch on his well-deserved treats. A lot of treats. If every household offers him 3 sugar cookies and 1 8-ounce glass of whole milk, that's 720 million cookies and enough milk to fill 23 Olympic swimming pools total. Now, that adds up to 396 billion calories. Plenty to see him through his hibernation until Christmas comes round again.